This is the Tokina Firin 20mm f2 lens for Sony full frame E-mount cameras. It's a small manual focus wide angle lens that costs just under £800. Now I've been using it for the last couple of weeks and I'm going to tell you exactly what I think. And this is the lens. It's the first in a new range of Tokina Firin lenses for the Sony E-mount cameras. Now the 20mm lens may seem like an odd focal length to start a new range, but in recent years Tokina has had a reputation for producing excellent wide-angle autofocus zoom lenses. So whilst the 20mm f2 manual focus lens is a bit of a departure from that, it does fit in with the company's heritage of wide-angle lenses. The lens itself is very small. It's got a nice metal construction and the 13 elements in 11 groups give the lens quite a weighty feel. Now, whilst weight doesn't always equal build quality, in this case it does feel extremely well made. The aperture ring is set towards the front of the lens, and for videographers there's also the option to switch the clicks on or off, so you can either have it running smoothly or clicking into each aperture. The focusing ring is really large and it's set towards the back of the lens here. It's really smooth and it's slightly less than 180 degrees to go from the 28cm minimum focus length all the way to infinity. There's also a depth of field scale just below the focus ring, and that's great news for landscape photographers and anybody who may want to preset their aperture and depth of field so that they can point and shoot. Street photographers, and even for checking the distances and the depth of field when you're shooting video. Now, just because this is a manual focus lens, that doesn't mean that there aren't electronics on board. The Tokina Firin 20mm f2 lens has communication with the camera electronically, so all the lens data, including the focal length, the aperture settings and the focus distance, can all be reported back to the camera. It also includes an electronic lens profile, so the camera can automatically apply lens corrections. But most importantly, this electronic communication means that the lens will work automatically with the in-camera stabilisation system on the current range of Sony A7 Mark II cameras, and of course also the new A9. Those with the first generation of A7 cameras, which don't have image stabilisation, will just need to keep half an eye on their shutter speed. But given that it's a 20mm focal length lens, keeping it still and choosing a fast enough shutter speed shouldn't be too much of an issue when shooting handheld. So I've used the lens on quite a few occasions over the last couple of weeks, including a trip to the Peak District where I shot entirely on the 20mm f2 lens for the whole weekend. So how did I find it? Let's start with manual focusing. Really straightforward and smooth. The lens focuses just slightly beyond infinity, which is good. And manual focusing is easy because that electronic connection between the camera and the lens means that the magnified focus assist is automatically displayed the second you just slightly turn that focus ring. Now, when you combine the focus peaking with the depth of field scale and the fact that the focus distance is displayed electronically either on the viewfinder or the screen, and it's really simple to make sure that everything you want in the scene is in focus from the front right to the back. So the lens hood. Generally the lens hood worked well. It's a nice looking hood, rectangular shape, quite reminiscent of Leica lens hoods, only this Tokina lens hood is made of plastic rather than metal. Now there is a catch with the lens hood. It isn't reversible. You can't flip it around the other way and put it back on the lens. And the fact it is rectangular and comes out quite far from the side can make it a little bit difficult to fit snugly in a camera bag. One of the scenes that I photographed was a sunset and I was shooting right into the sun, and the 20mm lens and its 9 aperture blades created a really nice 18-point sun star. Now there was a tiny little bit of lens flare, But to be honest, my bigger issue was actually trying to keep dust off my filter in front of the lens. When you're shooting landscapes at smaller apertures directly into the sun, even the smallest bit of dust on the filter in front of the lens becomes noticeable. But on the whole, the lens coating seemed to be doing a really good job of keeping actual lens flare under control. So onto image quality. The lens performs brilliantly, especially when you consider that its next nearest competitor is the Zeiss Loxia 21mm f2.8 lens, which is also £360 more. Now, as you would expect, the lens is sharpest at f8, and it has lovely sharp detail rendition right in the centre of the frame. This image is a RAW file, it's been opened in Lightroom, and then I've simply hit the export button. Nothing else has been done to it. It was shot at f11, and from memory, I think the focus point was the ground a little bit in front of the tree. As you can see, the centre is extremely sharp, but as you move across the image, what's noticeable is that even in the very corners, there's a really good amount of detail. It's not too distorted, and it's still quite sharp. It hasn't gone completely soft. Even individual blades of grass can be easily distinguished at these very corners of the frame. Now here is a really dull and boring image of the trunk of a bonsai tree in a pot. I'm sorry, I know this is terrible, but just bear with me a second. I focused on the bottom left corner, and if you haven't fallen asleep already looking at this image, just look how sharp the corner is, even when it's fully open at f2. Now, this image was taken at around 40 centimeters away from the subject, so even when close focusing in the corners, there is a decent amount of detail, as you can see. And guess what? It wouldn't be a proper lens test if we didn't have an equally dull photo of a brick wall to show curvilinear distortion. As you can see, curvilinear distortion is minimal. Now, this image was taken with all of the in-camera corrections turned off, so here is some nice back and forth transitions showing just the exact difference between the pure image from the lens and what the lens looks like when the in-camera correction has taken place. As you can see, it only takes a very slight adjustment to square everything off perfectly when the lens correction is on. And of course, this is a Sony camera, so those lens corrections can be applied to RAW files automatically when you're using Adobe Lightroom and Camera Raw. Okay, let's talk about chromatic aberrations. Now, I've searched through all of the images that I've taken with the Tokina 20mm lens, and I found very little sign of chromatic aberration. The images you are seeing are in-camera JPEG images with all the lens corrections turned off, and as you can see, there is the merest hint of chromatic aberration, and I found that you can only really see it when you zoom into around 200 to 400%. It's not really visible at 100% at all. However, I did do a more extreme test. I photographed some tree branches against an overexposed sky, a classic chromatic aberration test. Now here I did see some purple fringing, which is a form of chromatic aberration. However, it may be particular to the combination of the 20mm lens and Sony A7R. I couldn't really do much more research on this. I found it was present between f2 and f4, gone by f5.6, and again it's only a few pixels wide, easily corrected, and it was about the most extreme shooting situation, and you most likely won't find yourself shooting under these conditions. Now also remember, this lens will largely be used for landscape photography. Chromatic aberrations usually only affect a few widest apertures. We're talking f2 to f4 in this case. Now you're probably most likely shooting landscapes at f8 to f16, and it's unlikely that there's going to be any chromatic aberrations visible at all. So in summary, there's a tiny amount of chromatic aberration with this lens, but it is really nothing to worry about. Now, I did manage to borrow a Zeiss Loxia 20mm f2.8 lens for a very brief amount of time. Now we're talking minutes here, so I was limited with what I could do. So here's a shot of that brick wall again. Now the wall is around 1.5 meters away, and the lens was focused in the very center. Now looking at the center, the level of detail is slightly better at 2.8, f4 and f5.6 with the Tokina 20mm lens. Obviously it has a one-stop advantage over the Loxia, where the Loxia is f2.8 wide open compared to that being one stop down with the Tokina lens. However, at f8 and f11, things look a lot closer, and in my opinion, the Loxia just edges it for sharpness, but only just. In the corners it's a similar tail. The Tokina lens has the slight edge up to around f8, but then the differences between the sharpness of the two lenses become very little. If you factor in the fact that the Zeiss Loxia is a 21mm lens, and then you crop the 20mm Tokina lens images to match that frame, and obviously apply curvilinear distortion correction, then there actually isn't a huge amount of difference between the two lenses. But again, this was a very quick, quite unscientific test, but it did leave me even more impressed with the Tokina Firin lens. As wide angle lenses go, the Tokina 20mm f2 lens is really good. It has a nice solid construction to it. It handles really well. It has full electronic communication between the lens and the camera. And optically, it should be a legitimate consideration for landscape and architectural photographers who are prepared to manually focus. Now, the Zeiss Loxia probably just shades this lens in terms of image quality, but the Zeiss Loxia is also £360 more expensive. However, the Tokina 20mm f2 lens certainly doesn't feel like it should be £360 cheaper than the Zeiss lens, if you kind of see what I'm getting at. So Tokina have set their standards really high with this first Firin lens for Sony E-mount cameras, and if the rest of the lenses that are going to be coming out in this range are anything like this, I really can't wait to get my hands on them and try them out. So that's it, the Tokina Firin 20mm f2 lens. What do you think of it? And more importantly actually, what lenses do you want to see Tokina produce for Sony E-mount cameras? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up like button if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time on Photo Gear News.